Hey everybody, welcome to Raising Vibrations, and you're with Simon today. And in this video, I'm going to be talking a little bit about the nature of the soul from evolutionary astrology's perspective. I want to be addressing some key misconceptions that exist within the world around the nature of the ego. And I want to talk a little bit about how we as human beings, at least from the soul's perspective, incarnate many lifetimes to facilitate the desires that we're ultimately here to work through. And, the inspiration that came from this video was, looking at certain teachings and certain ideologies that are linked with that when we have this ego personality, right, and we have the spirituality of this ego, that somehow along the lines we've got to, let go or dissolve or surrender the ego and not have it at all. And the problem that I feel with this type of teaching and this type of information is not that it's incorrect, it's that the context of what it's trying to represent or what it really means, I think can get lost and confused. And I feel like a lot of people are running around trying to let go or dissolve or not live with an ego, and that causing more harm than the actual essence of what the purpose of the ego is about, right? So, I'm going to use EA's sort of approach to, experience or expressing the way that the ego works and its function, and how it's really important to develop a healthy ego as what the soul is trying to use in order to facilitate its desires. So, as you can see in the background over here, I've got these pictures, and this is part of my new, creative expression at the moment. I'm really loving it. And I've got the moon there, I've got the ship, and I've got the water, okay? And these three symbolize the context of how the soul, through the water trinity, okay, so we have the water trinity of Scorpio, Pisces, and Cancer, how this water trinity reflects to us how we evolve the desires of the soul, okay? And so the moon in this picture represents the sense of identity, okay? It's a full illumination where the sun provides light and the moon creates a reflection, just as we have within our personal lives and our sense of identity. Cancer, fourth house, and the moon all correlate to the ego structure within the context of the soul and this conscious sense of self, okay? And when we see the boat here, the ship, this is representing the physical form, okay? This is the Saturn archetype, and it reflects the nature of how we have this physical vessel that we are navigating, okay? And if you have a look at the water, you'll see that this is my representation of consciousness, okay? Feminine principle, simply representing the nature of ebb and flow, that everything is unified within the ocean. And so the form, or the boat, is navigating itself through consciousness, and the moon is representing this kind of navigation tool, okay, the illumination of everything. So Saturn, the moon, and Pisces are essential archetypes that, together with Pluto and the Scorpio archetype, reflect this way in which we incarnate these physical forms. And these physical forms hold consciousness. And within the context of that consciousness, we have an illuminated sense of self, right? So as we come onto this plane and we have all of these dynamics, part of us, the soul has certain desires, right? And each of us, relative to the house placement of Pluto, and I encourage you to go watch the Pluto videos that are on my website or on my YouTube channel, to look at your placement and contemplate them. A tremendous amount of depth can actually be understood by just analyzing and reflecting upon the nature of Pluto in your chart. So we have these desires, okay? And the desire nature is something that doesn't have an ego identity. It is simply just a propulsion of energy, right? Moving in a direction. So how do we essentially embody the context of these desires here on Earth? And the way that we do that is by the structure of the Saturn in our charts, and of course the moon, because the moon is the emotional integration and the reflection of these desires in physical form, and the physical form being the ship, right? So in order for us to have an ego, we need to be able to, well, in order for us to have an ego, our attachment to the sense of identity is what supports our ongoing process of understanding these desires. Now, the subtle difference over here is that it's about the recognition and understanding of that will differentiate from people that are still waking up to this inner truth, and the ones that are living out their reality, understanding that each circumstance and situation that they experience in a day is ultimately a path that the soul has already chosen. Okay? And it's simply unfolding, and the moon is reflecting to us what that path is about through the physical vessel of Saturn. Right? This is where our emotional growth takes place. Now, if we had to let go of the ego, if we had to separate it, we wouldn't be able to know what the context of those desires are about. We wouldn't be able to essentially identify with our life at a conscious level, because these desires are inherently unconscious. They arise. So the ego, in the definition of my conversation with you and through the paradigm of VA, is that it's your physical life. It's, for me, it is the way that I identify with myself. It's the life that I have. It's the attachments that I have to the physical earth, and it is the relationship to what those are reflecting back to me that will give me insights into the core underlying context as to why I'm here. And so it's a self-reflective tool that is essentially needing to be integrated in order to understand these underlying dynamics. And of course, every single one of us, when in this state, will be able to access consistently deeper and deeper and deeper layers of why this life is in existence. You know, you just need to look at how you've experienced your journey up until this point in time. If we had to get rid of the ego, how would we identify with these things? How would the soul know what it's actually here to experience and to culminate its desires? So it's an essential thing to understand that the definition of the ego structure in a healthy way is that it's the material plane and our attachment to that. The dissolving function is when we have a Plutonian transit, or when we outgrow the circumstances and situations, and those attachments, those ego attachments to the physical, no longer are needed. Right? This is why when we go through a Pluto transit in our chart, whether it be to Saturn, whether it be to our south node, whether it be to our moon, that is when the principle of surrender our attachments to that sort of life form, or that experience, or that phase of your life, that's the keyword I'm really looking for, that's when this principle applies. But to surrender it completely and to not have an identity is very dangerous. Okay, it's the physical form, it's the XY axis of your coordinates that moves you across this ocean of consciousness. Okay, and you wouldn't be able to be identified if this ego attachment wasn't there. So it's essential for us to have this ego self, right? And I'm going to use the water trine in a couple of slides over here to really drive this understanding home. But before I do that, I want to talk a little bit about the nature of reincarnation. And I was really excited amped to share this video, because I feel like this is a beautiful way to truly illustrate how the soul incarnates itself life after life after life, and here to resolve its desires, and that the soul doesn't actually extinguish itself. It's just simply the physical life itself, right? So death being the end of a cycle regarding a specific lifetime that the soul chose to incarnate through, right? So this is hold on, there we go. Okay, so this is a description of a tea, or a teacup, or a bowl with some water in it and the moon. And so the difference between the ship and this picture is that the ship is now represented through the bowl, and the bowl is representing the ship, right? It's the container. And within the container is this consciousness, and within the consciousness is the reflection of the moon. And this is a quote, like I said, from Yogananda, and he explains it like this. You know, when you see the definition and the bowl as the container, and you see the water as the reflection of awareness or consciousness, and you see the moon as the spirit, okay, as you see the moon as the soul, the light, okay, this is an incarnation that you have right now. This is a specific lifetime in which your arena and path is being experienced. Now, when we break that bowl, okay, the water seeps out. But the light does not cease to exist anymore just because you can't see the reflection of the moon in the water. And so the thing that he's trying to explain here is that the nature of reincarnation is that when we exist in our form and we're here, we have this container and we see the reflection. But when we die, in other words, when that bowl gets broken and the water seeps out of it, that the soul doesn't disappear with that process. It simply just becomes invisible to the reflection of our egocentric structure. And so the light is still shining, the moon is still there. And if we had to take another bowl and we put some water in it and we put it in the exact same position, the moon will come back to the reflection, because essentially the consciousness is reflecting the moon's light held within the bowl. And this is exactly what the human experience is. So each of us, when we look at our astrology chart, and this is another thing that I want to encourage, is that when we're looking at the astrology chart, what we're looking at is, what does that bowl look like? And what is the path that this lifetime is about? And when we read it from that point of view, and we understand that there are desire natures that are coming in from previous lifetimes, and that's exactly where you left off, and now you're over here and you're doing this, and then the next lifetime you're doing that, and it's accumulation of multiple lives, you know, trying to resolve certain desires, ultimately. So the next time you find yourself wanting to explain reincarnation, this is a great way to illustrate this natural phenomena and law that exists. You know, it's something that can be, you know, used, and it's not abstract. Okay. So here we have the natural zodiac, and what I mean by the natural zodiac is simply that we've got these 12 signs, and they represent a 360-degree circle. And so this is the map of the psyche, okay? Different to the constellations, right? The zodiac, the natural zodiac here, and the constellations have different degrees of expression. But this is mapping the psyche. So when we take the natural zodiac and we begin to look at how key archetypes interface with other archetypes, we can actually see this natural law exist on this 2D, you know, picture. So Capricorn itself is the ship, okay? And it's the container that essentially binds the process of how the soul is going to evolve itself. Just like with a river, for instance, you know, if you look at a river or a stream, there are two banks on each side, or one bank on each side. And the earth element that is sitting on the side of it like that, okay, that is the Capricorn function. And then the stream is moving through the middle, yeah? So Capricorn is a function that exists within this process. And when we begin to then make connections between Capricorn, Pisces, and Scorpio, there is a sextile between the two signs. So Capricorn sextiles Pisces, and Scorpio sextiles Capricorn, and of course Capricorn sextiles them both, right? These are a 60-degree difference between each other. And they are supporting angles. They're both yin as well, right? Pisces and Scorpio and Capricorn are yin energy. So it's feminine and it's receptive. So we're talking about the context of how these symbols interface with each other, creating this phenomena, right? So Pisces to Scorpio is a water trine, of course, and it represents to us this attachment. So desire is rooted in Scorpio through attachment. I desire that, or I desire that. And we move towards it. Now the desire nature arises out of the inspiration, Neptune. okay? Right? Just as the wave arises out of the ocean, it doesn't identify itself as separate. Yet, initially, when we come onto this existence and we're still working through our ego attachments, we're recognizing that the ego can perceive itself as different. And this is where another one of these core teachings is essential to clarify, is that ultimately what this teaching of dissolving the ego or letting go of the ego, what it's really trying to say here is that part of a spiritual process is to surrender the idea of one's human desires into the soul's desires. Now, let me make it more clearer than that. If your desire nature in this lifetime is to experience certain things, and that the ego is orientated towards seeing those attachments as serving the soul's deeper desires, then this is a healthy process, because the ego is essentially in alignment with the soul, and that the ego is supporting the soul's process. It's facilitating its physical experience. But when we have these separating desires, i.e. that when the ego is perceiving itself separate, that's when duality comes into play, and that's where the separation and me and you exists. Now, ironically, duality is a part of this process. That's one of the functions of this reality, is to experience ourselves through the contrast. But to know ourselves as separate is something entirely completely different. It is ultimately that the soul is coming back to the ocean and recognizing each desire is a desire of separation until eventually it wants to reunite. And this is ultimately what we're here to do, is to reunite ourselves with the original desire as to why this was taking place, to understand the totality of consciousness, and that the ego supports that process. It becomes one, but not one in the sense of, where everybody just gets forgiven, because at the end of the day, the ego is still going to be damaged. The ego is still going to be affected by the earthly conditioning field, which is another thing that I want to talk about in terms of things like addiction. So here we have this Pisces trine Scorpio dynamic. And so what arises out of the ocean is desire and attachment, inspiration, meaning, purpose. So Scorpio, attachment, meaning, purpose, inspiration, idealization, Neptune. And so Capricorn is the vehicle. Now what happens here between the natural trine with Cancer and Pisces being water as well, is that the Cancer archetype firstly makes a 180-degree opposition to Capricorn, right? So we know here that we have this moon and we have the Saturn component, and that within the context of this ego definition, this ego sense of self, Cancer Capricorn, moon Saturn, we have the alignment of this meaning, this inspiration. Okay, so Pisces to Cancer is how this spirit or delusion or separation of idealistic meaning is moving us towards this attachment. So the movement of attachment is the Cancer to Scorpio dynamic, right? So the water trinity here is how we can either be experiencing the attachment of an inspiring desire that leads to a deeper understanding of why we're here, or it can be simply just an illusion that arises, and from that illusion we essentially become empowered through that illusion, and then the ego sense of self, Cancer, forms the attachment. What you thought it was and what it really was. And it's here in this dynamic that we actually experience the deepening of the soul, the dark night of the soul. The dark night of the soul is represented through the Cancer, Capricorn, Pisces, Scorpio axis. Because what is essentially happening here is that the ego attachment to the reality of your life is simply now eroding, Pisces. And the process of elimination, Scorpio, is supporting that death of that ego attachment that once served the purpose and a meaning of that life. And now, as you go through the death of the ego and the rebirth of a new one, right, that transition period between the two is that dark night of the soul in which you're discovering the essence of being. And the reason why it's so incredibly scary for everybody is because nobody actually at the age of, 7 years old began to have spiritual teachings. It lacks it in our culture. We don't understand that the ego attachment that makes us feel secure and that we have a boundary on is no longer available during that period of time as we're exploring the depths of our own desires. So imagine if you were on that boat and all of a sudden the boat started to sink. Would you panic? Yes, that's right. So when we go through Pluto transits, or when we go through dark night of the soul experiences and the death of the ego, i.e. the experience of the core attachments to what represented once the purpose in life is now ending, so the bowl is breaking, right? And then eventually at some point a rebirth takes place. And out of that rebirth is a new entire direction. But we don't know about it. So again, it's still scary. And to the monkey mind, this is intense. So for any of you that are experiencing this right now, I encourage you to know that you're not going insane. There's nothing wrong with you. You're simply just processing through a huge life change. And to allow yourself the freedom to explore those dynamics within inside of yourself. This is a wonderful opportunity, even if it appears to the psyche and to the mind as if this is insanity. One of the things that I wanted to talk about with this as well was, and this was a big part of the inspiration, is this idea of, disassociation, void, meaninglessness, absence of purpose, and how when we get rid of the ego, we're getting rid of suffering. And the problem is that, or at least the issue that I have with this, is that when we talk about getting rid of suffering, what we're actually trying to get rid of essentially is the duality in perception. We're trying to see that the experience that we're witnessing right now within ourselves is not something that is separate, even if it appears that way, i.e. that the ego is perceiving this as like, why would this happen to me? And this is again the water trinity over here, Pisces, the sacrifice, the loss, the hopelessness, Scorpio, the ending, the loss, the meaning, the attachment, and the death experience. And then the Cancer archetype saying, I'm feeling like I can't actually connect to this emotionally. I'm physically witnessing the separation. So within the context of society and the void that we feel within ourselves, the void that we feel is because of the conditioning of the world that we lived in which what we've defined as empowering and what we've defined as meaning and purpose has been existential. And now that Pluto is transiting through Capricorn, and now that Pluto will be transiting over its own south node, that Saturn's over Capricorn and transiting over its own south node in Capricorn, and the nodes now moving into Capricorn as well, you can get the very, very strong picture that if the outer circumstances and situations and structures in which our empowerment, Scorpio, has been attached to, sextile Capricorn Scorpio, and the meaning of that existence, Pisces sextile Capricorn, Pisces trine Scorpio, is now dissolving, think about the trigger effect that's going to happen with Cancer at the bottom over there going, oh shit, all of our security. So the void that we're experiencing that we need to consistently keep reuptaking, in other words, using highs like, for instance, addictions, they're all manifested because the meaning of life, the attachment to the purpose is linked outside, and when that dissolves or when that's not available anymore, then there is nothing inside of us because we can't connect to that space because it's absent, it's lost, it's meaningless. Now, there are parts to this experience that the soul will actually go through in a natural way, meaning that, if you have Neptune transit your 10th house and you've got, say, Sun in Scorpio as an example, rest assured you're going to have an experience of all attachments that were rooted in illusion and fantasy will be removed, and you will experience that loss of meaning. And depression can take place. So here we have this important message that to lose the ego, to get rid of the ego is impossible. It would mean that you would need to kill yourself. And that is really, really scorpionic straight away there, because that's, and I'm being that way for a specific reason, because the ego itself is the life. Now, it's your emotional relationship to the context of that life that can go through different changes and different phases. And yes, we would have to surrender certain attachments, emotional attachments, to the context of what that phase was about. Absolutely. But to simply get rid of the ego is not possible unless you went to another plane. Okay, everybody. I really hope that you got something out of this conversation today. And of course, if you're wanting to learn more about astrology itself, I'm really always excited to share that my astrology school is on my website, and you can always inquire about how to learn and study through the different ways. You know, it's completely self-study, and you can go at your own pace, and it's a wonderful way to be able to actually get in touch with the nature of your chart if you want to read it for yourself, or if you want to become a professional astrologer as well. Okay, everybody, thanks very much. I'd love to hear your comments in the comment section. I felt like this was a fun video to do in the context of a deeper truth, and I really hope that, like I said, you got something out of this. All right, everybody, thanks very much for listening and your time. Take care. Bye-bye.